There is something deeply strange about funerals. We dress in our best clothes, stand around a carefully decorated box, whisper to people we already know, and pretend the tiny sandwiches are helping. But this awkward ritual is not a modern invention. Long before cemeteries, priests, headstones, or floral arrangements priced like small appliances, ancient humans also had to confront the same terrible problem. Someone they loved was alive yesterday, and now they were not. So what did they do? Did they bury the body? Leave it in a cave, burn it, eat it? Keep the skull around as a deeply unsettling family heirloom? The answer is all of the above, depending on when, where, and which group of humans we are talking about. And the story reaches much farther back than civilization itself, into a time when death rituals were not yet traditions. They were experiments. Experiments in grief, memory, fear, and the growing suspicion that a dead person was somehow still a person. Before humans could invent funerals, they had to achieve something much harder. They had to understand that death was permanent. That sounds obvious now, because modern humans are raised inside a culture that explains death constantly. We have hospitals, obituaries, movies, religious traditions, legal documents, and at least one relative who brings up inheritance far too early. But for an early hominin, death was not a concept taught in words. It was a pattern learned through experience. A body stopped moving. It stopped responding. It became cold, changed color, began to smell, and eventually attracted animals that were not coming to pay their respects. Many social animals react strongly to death. Elephants have been observed touching bones and lingering near dead companions. Some primates remain beside corpses, carry dead infants, or repeatedly inspect an unresponsive group member. These behaviors do not prove that animals hold funerals or imagine an afterlife. That would be a very large conclusion built from a very small pile of observations. But they do show that attachment does not disappear the instant a heartbeat stops. For our ancestors, that attachment was especially important because hominin survival depended on unusually intense cooperation. Humans shared food, protected children, cared for injured group members, remembered relationships, and relied on one another for knowledge. A person was not just another body in the landscape. They were a walking database of water sources, edible plants, dangerous valleys, family alliances, and which mushrooms caused everyone to speak confidently to rocks. Losing someone therefore created more than sadness. It created a social emergency. The group had to recognize that the missing person would not return to gather food, guard the camp, teach a child, or settle an argument. Their duties had to be redistributed. Their dependents had to be protected. Their possessions had to be claimed, shared, or avoided. Even before formal ritual existed, death forced the living to reorganize themselves. And then there was memory. As human brains became better at recalling individuals, anticipating the future, and understanding the minds of others, a dead companion could remain psychologically present. The person was gone, but their face, voice, habits, and relationships continued inside the group. That mismatch may be one of the deepest roots of mourning. The body says absence, while the mind keeps producing presence. This also created a uniquely human problem. A corpse looked like someone familiar, but behaved like an object. It occupied an uncomfortable border between person and thing. Once early humans could recognize that border, remember the individual, and understand that the condition would not reverse, they possessed the mental foundation for mortuary behavior. They did not yet need religion. They did not need a theory of souls. They only needed affection, memory, and enough experience to realize that death was not sleep. Sleep has better recovery statistics. The first funeral probably did not begin with theology. It began with logistics. A member of the group died near camp, and for a while, nobody knew what to do. The body was still recognizable, it still belonged to someone. But it was also becoming a biological event with terrible timing. Within hours, the corpse began changing. Insects arrived, scavengers noticed, smell traveled. Predators that usually avoided a noisy human camp suddenly had a reason to investigate. Grief had acquired a customer service department. Early humans now faced several possible responses. They could abandon the campsite, drag the body away, cover it with branches, place it in a natural hollow, push it into a cave, or dig into the ground using hands and simple tools. None of these actions required a belief in an afterlife. They only required a dead body, a functioning nose, and a reasonable desire not to attract hyenas. But practical disposal could easily become something more. Imagine a group moving the body of a familiar person away from camp. They choose a protected place because it is nearby, safe, and difficult for scavengers to reach. Perhaps they return later and recognize the location. Perhaps another person dies, and the group uses the same place again. Now the landscape contains memory. A cave is no longer just a cave. A hill is no longer just a hill. It becomes the place where certain people went after death. This is how behavior can grow into tradition without anyone formally inventing it. One generation repeats what the previous generation did, not because the ancestors left written instructions, but because familiarity feels correct during moments of uncertainty. When nobody knows what death means, copying the last response is an excellent management strategy. The treatment of the corpse may also have been shaped by emotion. Some bodies could have been left exposed because the group needed to move quickly. Others may have been protected because relatives resisted abandonment. A parent might remain near a dead child. A companion might return repeatedly. Someone might cover the face because looking at it was unbearable. That final possibility is speculative, of course. Archaeology rarely preserves emotional breakdowns. Tears have terrible fossilization potential. Still, small practical actions can carry emotional meaning even when they begin accidentally. Covering a body keeps animals away, but it also hides decay. Placing stones on top prevents disturbance, but it also marks a location. Leaving an object beside the dead may begin as reluctance to reclaim it, then later become an offering. And fire added another possibility. Humans already used flames for warmth, cooking, protection, and landscape management. At some point, a body may have burned accidentally in a campfire, house fire, or deliberately cleared area. The result would have been dramatic. Flesh vanished, bones changed color, and the person became portable fragments. That discovery offered a strange solution. Fire could transform the dead quickly, reduce smell, discourage scavengers, and allow remains to be carried. Practical, powerful, and extremely difficult not to interpret. The problem with searching for the first funeral is that the ground is an unreliable witness. Bones can fall into pits, floods can move bodies, caves can collapse, carnivores can rearrange a skeleton with all the respect of an airport baggage handler. So archaeologists look for several clues at once: an articulated skeleton, a deliberately excavated hollow, unusual body positioning, protective covering, repeated use of the same location, or objects placed beside the dead. One of the strangest early cases comes from Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones in northern Spain. Deep inside a cave system, researchers found the remains of at least 28 early humans dating back roughly 430,000 years. The concentration is extraordinary, but whether bodies were deliberately deposited there remains debated. It may represent intentional disposal, an accident, or geological processes doing something suspiciously organized. Clearer evidence appears much later in the Levant. At Skhul and Qafzeh caves in present-day Israel, early Homo sapiens were placed in what many researchers accept as intentional burials around 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. Several bodies were positioned deliberately, and some were associated with animal remains or red ochre. At Qafzeh, one adolescent was buried with deer antlers placed near the upper body. That does not automatically mean the antlers were a passport to the afterlife, but they probably were not accidental pocket lint. Recent work at Tinshemet cave has added another major piece to the story. The site preserves several Middle Paleolithic burials dating broadly between about 130,000 and 80,000 years ago, along with abundant ochre and objects associated with the bodies. Together with Skhul and Qafzeh, Tinshemet suggests that deliberate burial in the Levant was not a single creative moment. It may have been a shared regional behavior practiced by different human groups. Then there are the Neanderthals of Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. Excavations uncovered multiple individuals, including an articulated adult now called Shanidar Z, whose body appears to have been placed in a natural depression near earlier Neanderthal remains. This supports the possibility that the same area was repeatedly used for the dead. Shanidar is famous for the so-called flower burial, based on pollen found near one skeleton. The romantic interpretation was that Neanderthals placed flowers around the body. It is a beautiful image. Unfortunately, burrowing rodents also collect flowers. The pollen evidence remains controversial, but the broader case for deliberate body placement is stronger than the bouquet, and that distinction matters. Archaeology rarely gives us a complete funeral. It gives us a bent knee, disturbed soil, a patch of pigment, and one extremely patient scientist asking whether a hyena could have done it. Ancient death practices become especially difficult to interpret when the evidence looks both meaningful and horrifying. Consider a human bone covered in cut marks. One explanation is nutritional cannibalism. Another is ritual defleshing. Another is secondary burial, where a body was allowed to decompose before the bones were cleaned, moved, or displayed. and another is that someone urgently needed food and philosophical nuance was not available. The marks themselves cannot explain motive. At Qafzeh Cave in England, human remains dating to roughly 15,000 years ago show cut marks, breakage for marrow extraction, and evidence that some skulls were carefully shaped into cups. The processing resembles butchery, yet the skull cups required deliberate craftsmanship beyond simply obtaining calories. These people may have consumed the dead, transformed them ritually, honored them, humiliated enemies, or combined several intentions at once. Humans are talented multitaskers. Even burial can be ambiguous. A skeleton found in a depression may have been intentionally placed there, or the person may have died in a natural hollow. A cluster of bodies might indicate a cemetery, a catastrophe, repeated accidents, or a cave that functioned as an extremely unfortunate trap. This is why archaeologists argue about context. Was the grave shape clearly cut into older sediment? Were the bones still arranged anatomically? Did scavengers disturb them? Were objects intentionally placed nearby, or did they happen to be in the same layer? Was ochre sprinkled on the body, already present in the soil, or carried there by later water movement? Every interpretation must compete against geology, animals, and coincidence. There is also a larger debate about what burial actually proves. Some researchers view deliberate burial as evidence of symbolic thought, emotional attachment, or beliefs about an afterlife. Others warn that practical reasons are sufficient. Covering a corpse controls smell, limits scavenging, and protects a campsite. A grave can be meaningful without being religious. And then there is the most dangerous archaeological phrase of all: grave goods. An object beside a body may be an offering. It may also be ordinary debris, an item attached to clothing, or something that slipped into the grave afterward. A shell near the hand looks poetic until someone remembers that the cave floor contains 4,000 shells. The safest conclusion is not that ancient humans lacked complex beliefs. It is that beliefs rarely fossilize cleanly. What survives is behavior. Bodies were sometimes protected, processed, revisited, painted, dismembered, burned, arranged, or placed in recurring locations. Those actions suggest that death mattered socially, even when the exact meaning remains inaccessible. The dead were not always simply discarded, but neither did every pit come with a theology department. Once humans began treating the dead in repeatable ways, death stopped being merely an emergency. It became an institution. A practical act such as covering a body could turn into a rule. The rule could become a tradition. The tradition could become sacred. And eventually, someone would insist the ceremony had to be performed exactly this way, because that was how the ancestors did it, even though the ancestors had probably been improvising. Repeated burial grounds were especially powerful because they tied communities to specific places. A group that returned to bury its dead in the same cave, valley, or settlement was doing more than disposing of bodies. It was planting memory into the landscape. This is where the dead began to shape territory. A burial place could communicate that a group belonged there because its parents, grandparents, and remembered ancestors were physically part of the land. Long before written property deeds, a grave could function as a deeply emotional boundary marker. Our family is here. Please stop hunting near the sacred hill. As societies became larger and more settled, funerals also became public performances of identity. The treatment of a body revealed age, gender, occupation, family connections, status, and perhaps spiritual role. Some people received simple burials. Others were covered in ochre, decorated with ornaments, placed beside weapons, surrounded by animal parts, or dressed in clothing that required enormous labor to produce. The Upper Paleolithic burials at Sungir, in present-day Russia, are among the most spectacular examples. Roughly 34,000 years ago, individuals were buried with thousands of ivory beads, carved objects, and elaborate grave goods. 2 children were laid head-to-head with decorated spears and ornaments that may have taken thousands of working hours to manufacture. The children had not lived long enough to earn that wealth through decades of personal achievement, so their status may have been inherited. That is a major social development. It suggests that identity could survive beyond the individual and move through family lines. Death rituals were no longer only about grief. They could advertise hierarchy, strengthen alliances, display generosity, and remind everyone who belonged to which important relatives. Funerals also created gatherings. People traveled, shared food, exchanged objects, retold stories, resolved disputes, formed marriages, and renewed group bonds. The corpse was the center of the event, but the ceremony reorganized the living. Even today, funerals often become accidental reunions where cousins meet for the first time and quietly debate whether anyone remembers the deceased's Wi-Fi password. Ritual also gave grief a schedule. Without custom, mourners face an unbearable number of decisions. Where should the body go? Who touches it? What objects remain with it? When does the group leave? A ritual answers these questions in advance. It turns chaos into sequence. Wash the body. Prepare the grave. Place the objects. Speak the names. Remember. By repeating these actions, humans transformed death from a private rupture into a shared social process. The deceased became an ancestor, a warning, a protector, a symbol, or a political asset. Because even after death, humans found a way to network. Today, death arrives surrounded by technology. We have hospitals that monitor the final heartbeat, refrigerated rooms that delay decay, crematoriums that reduce a body to ash with industrial precision, and websites where grief can remain online indefinitely. A person may disappear physically while their photos, messages, playlists, voice recordings, and aggressively opinionated social media posts continue to exist. The tools are new. The problem is prehistoric. Modern funerals still perform the same basic tasks our ancestors faced. We protect or transform the body. We gather the community. We redistribute possessions and responsibilities. We tell stories that preserve the dead person inside collective memory. Then we use ritual to mark the moment when someone changes from a member of the living group into someone who belongs to the past. Burial, cremation, embalming, sky burial, memorial jewelry, roadside shrines, and digital tribute pages may look radically different, but each attempts to solve the same impossible contradiction. The person is gone. The relationship is not. That may explain why humans have treated corpses with such extraordinary care, fear, tenderness, violence, and creativity. A dead body is biological evidence that life has ended, but it is also the last visible anchor of a social connection. We know the body is no longer the person, yet we cannot treat it as though it were merely an object. So we wash it, dress it, burn it, bury it, carry it up mountains. Place flowers around it, assuming the rodents have not already handled that part. Ancient funerary behavior was not born in a single grave or invented by one brilliant Ice Age event planner. It emerged gradually from attachment, practical necessity, memory, repetition, and the growing human ability to live inside symbols. Eventually, the dead became ancestors. Ancestors became identity. Identity became territory, hierarchy, religion, and history. And perhaps that is the real purpose of a funeral. It does not defeat death. It makes death socially survivable. Every time we stand beside a coffin, scatter ashes, preserve a photograph, or tell a familiar story about someone who is no longer here, we are doing something unimaginably old. We are insisting that absence does not erase belonging, which is beautiful. It is also why, after hundreds of thousands of years of cultural evolution, we still gather around a carefully decorated box, speak in hushed voices, and eat tiny sandwiches as though they contain the answer.